Mr. Chairman, I am Amy Oliver Cook from the Independence Institute. I write on energy for the Independence Institute, and I'm just going to hope that you like my policy suggestions as much as you like saying my name. Thank you for having me here, and I'm going to defer most of the testimony today to my colleague William Yeatman. I just want to make one thing clear about the Independence Institute when it comes to energy policy. We are completely agnostic on fuel sources, energy sources. We are in all of the above. We subscribe to a least cost principle and an end to subsidies. We would prefer them to all sources of energy. And with that in mind, that's why we are concerned about House Bill 1291 and the state implementation plan. And that's where I'm going to defer to my colleague, William Yeatman.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is William Yeatman. I work for the Competitive Enterprise Institute. It's a libertarian think tank inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. But I write for the Independence Institute on Colorado energy policy, and I've been following this particular issue, the Regional Haze State Implementation Plan, very closely. I'd like to address two issues, two salient issues. First, the questionable legality of certain components of this plan. And second, this notion of the big brother boogeyman, whereby if you do not enact this plan ASAP, the federal government is going to crack down immediately on Colorado and usurp their air quality plan. That's not true. Under Colorado statute, it is illegal for the Air Quality Control Commission to impose emissions controls pursuant to the Clean Air Act that are more stringent than what the federal government requires. As interpreted by the Legislative Council, quote, the federal floor for state implementation plans becomes, in effect, a state ceiling. Now, to be sure, the General Assembly can exempt certain plants from this prohibition on controls more stringent than what the federal government requires. And indeed, the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, HB 1365, is a component of this Regional Haze State Implementation Plan. And by enacting HB 1365, the General Assembly, in essence, did exempt certain power plants, those subject to reasonably foreseeable air quality requirements from this statutory prohibition on controls. And in particular, I'm thinking of the Pawnee Power Plant, west of Denver, Cherokee 1 through 4 power plants in Adams County, and the Valmont Power Plant near Boulder. So those were exempt. However, Hayden 1 and 2 power plants were not exempt. So this exemption to the statutory prohibition on controls more stringent than the federal government does not apply to, say, Hayden 1 and 2. I believe also, this came to my attention through Carol's testimony, through Craig 1 and 2 as well. So they are not exempt from the prohibition. With that in mind, the Environmental Protection Agency considered $1,660 per ton of nitrogen oxides reduced to be a cost threshold. That was they clearly indicated in their 2005 BART, or Regional Haze Implementation Guidelines, that they considered this $1,600 roughly, that's adjusted for inflation. At 2005 it was $1,500 per ton reduced of NOx to be a ceiling, a cost ceiling. The AQCC based its decisions on a $5,000 a ton NOx per ton of NOx reduced. So there's clearly discrepancy there. The cost ceiling for the EPA being $1,600, the Air Quality Control Commission used $5,000 a ton. They also based that $5,000 a ton threshold on similar controls, similar requirements for public health-based regulations. I'll note here that Regional Haze is an aesthetic regulation. This has nothing to do with public health. I believe it was mentioned by the gentleman representing AQCC that there were health co-benefits. Well, you can't take that into consideration. This is an aesthetic regulation. Regarding the type of nitrogen oxides controls selected by the AQCC, the Environmental Protection Agency wrote that, quote, we have not determined that it, and this is the selective catalytic reduction, these are the SCR that was mentioned by the gentleman, Mr. Iron. The EPA wrote that we have not determined that it is generally cost effective. So again, point blank, the EPA says these particular controls are not cost effective. Furthermore, Hayden 1 and 2 would comply with the EPA's presumptive limits. Now, this is the regional haze is unique amongst the provisions of the Clean Air Act in that it affords the states an extraordinary amount of discretion, unlike other provisions, say NAAQS, or National Ambient Air Quality Controls, or National Ambient Air Quality Standards, whereby the EPA would be in the driver's seat. For this particular regulation, regional haze, it is the state in the driver's seat. With that in mind, the EPA put forth presumptive limits, which is it's exactly as it sounds. They presume, in essence, recommended limits, not legally binding, I should say. With the installation of controls, okay, so Hayden 1 and 2 would comply with these recommended limits, emissions limits for nitrogen oxides, with controls that are $100 million less expensive than what the AQCC imposed. It's not difficult to understand why the EPA concluded that the AQCC's preferred controls are not cost effective. For $140 million, the benefit is that Coloradans would have a 17% chance of perceiving an otherwise imperceptible visibility improvement at the Mount Zirkle wilderness area for 34 days a year. That's not a great deal of benefit for a huge cost. Let's see. I will note that for whatever reason, Colorado's statutory prohibition on controls more stringent than what the federal government requires was not brought up. As I could not find it in the meeting minutes from the November 18th AQCC meeting where they adopted these Hayden 1 and 2 controls. It did not come up. To my knowledge, it also did not come up on April 11th when the House enacted, or I'm sorry, when the House passed HB 1291. So at some point, I do believe this should be discussed, this should be deliberated, whether or not these provisions are indeed illegal and contradict with Colorado law. So that pertains to the dubious, or in my opinion, dubious legality of the state implementation plan or provisions thereof. I'll also note briefly this notion that the federal government is going to crack down unless you enact this plan as is ASAP. This is akin to saying that the bank is going to foreclose on your home if you miss a utility bill payment or miss a credit card payment. It's just not the way things work. I will remind you that when people were pushing for HB 1365, the exact same talking point was used. I believe it was ex-Senate Minority Leader Josh Penry who authored an op-ed, The Conservative Case for HB 1365, in which he laid out this exact same argument. He said, unless we submit this plan unless we enact the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, and unless we have a compressed electric resource plan, so normally it's 18 months. That's how long it takes for the PUC to approve a resource acquisition plan. For the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, it was 4 months. This regional haze state implementation plan process was also accelerated for the AQCC. These compressed timeframes, we were told, were necessary due to this hard deadline, January 15, 2011. We've got to have this regional haze state implementation plan due to the EPA. Otherwise, we risk a federal implementation plan. Same exact argument. January 15th came and went. Nothing happened. The EPA is yet to prepare that deadline. That takes time. I'll note that Montana is still working on its regional haze plan. It's still in the regulatory phase. In essence, there is no rush. You certainly have time to deliberate. You certainly have time to consider as to whether or not there are components of this plan that are illegal. I will note that next Monday, S237, legislation put forth by Senator Kevin Lundberg, would address these particular issues, the Hayden 1 and 2. So I do beg, I'm not quite sure how this would work, but for you to enact HB 1291 before next Monday, I don't think S236 or S237 could carry the force of law. I don't think you could, once you enact HB 1291 and send it to the EPA, you can't change it. So I beg you, or I would strongly suggest, or I'm here to testify on behalf, perhaps waiting, deliberating, learning as to whether or not this is legal, and certainly don't be scared by federal Big Brother. There's no crackdown. And that's my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Yeatman, was it?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Questions? Kevin?
Thank you. You mentioned the cost for NOx reduction per ton set by the EPA of $1,660 ceiling and to the AQCC at $5,000. Is that what this plan finally runs out as far as the reduction cost at $5,000 per ton?
For
Yeah.
the, oh, I'm sorry, sir.
That's all right.
Senator, so were you asking as to whether or not are all the controls within this plan at the $5,000 a ton threshold? Or
I guess I'm asking, what do they come out to? If we have a $1,600, you said the AQCC had some ceiling of $5,000, which obviously is a significant difference. Do we have any evaluation of what this finally will cost to make these reductions under these plans versus this EPA amount of $1,660 per ton?
we know that based upon that,
I'm sorry, Mr. Yeatman.
yes, sir. We know that based upon the $5,000 a ton nitrogen oxides reduced threshold, that the selective catalytic reduction controls that Mr. Ireland spoke of were deemed cost-effective by the AQCC. Now that comes out to be roughly $140 million for the Hayden 1 and 2 power plants. These are mid-sized power plants. We know that controls that would comply with the EPA's presumptive limits and would therefore, I mean, unless the EPA changes its guidelines, goes through a public rulemaking and such, one would have to assume that if they meet these presumptive limits, they would get approved by the EPA. We know those controls, combustion controls, upgrading the combustion controls would cost, very, very roughly speaking, at least $120 odd million less than the EPA's controls, or I'm sorry, than the AQCC's controls, based upon that $5,000 threshold.
Ms. Cook?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did read in Xcel Energy's annual report, just recently released, that they anticipate that the state implementation plan would cost roughly, and this is overall, $1 billion over the next decade.
Any other questions of Ms. Cook or Mr. Yeatman? Thank you both.